computer where everybody's signing in and signing out, that's gonna take time away from your presentation. So I recommend that you bring that on a USB drive. You can, put it right on the computer tower down here, and signing into email. I think this is gonna be a little slow with all the two-factor authentication that we're having to do these days. Remember, in terms of grading and assessment, the main criteria for projects is how well the artistic representation reflects an understanding of the culture that created it, and how well this is expressed by the presentation and essay. So, in other words, I'm not just going on, what's the best, most aesthetically pleasing image, but rather, how does your presentation and how does your essay show a sophisticated understanding of the artwork in its proper art historical and cultural context. So that is the basics of what is expected of your presentation. You should have your completed work. If it's a physical thing, please bring it to class. If it's digital, have a way to show it to us, right? And be ready together with your partner or group to explain your design choices and why you made those choices. And that should be on the basis of primary sources and secondary sources. Does that make sense? Okay, so those of you that made it to class today have the opportunity to give me your preference for presentation days. I'm gonna have to look at how many groups you have, and I'm not sure I can give everybody their first choice, but I'm gonna do my best, and I'll post that presentation schedule by Wednesday on Canvas, okay? So, does everybody have a piece of paper? If you could please, write down the names, and we only need one piece of paper per group. Write down your first and last name of every group member. Write down, just to remind me, what you're presenting, what work of art you're presenting, and then your preference. And, we're doing this in class after Thanksgiving, so your possibilities are either December 1st or December 3rd. So you need all of your names of group members, first and last, please. Your topic, that is what you are reconstructing, what lost work of art you're remaking, and then your preference for December 1st or December 3rd. You might have to work that out with your group and decide which one you prefer. And what I'm thinking here, if I get all requests for the later date, I'm going to take these pieces of paper and throw them in a hat and do a drawing. But maybe some people want to get it out of the way on December 1st. So only one piece of paper per group. Thank you. Contact for us to get the key if you want to use that next week. You think that's something you'd want to do?
At least they'll just try to be able to get it down.
Give a presentation. Yeah. Oh, do you want to do this? Oh,
that's.
Yep. I thought it was cats. Okay. Great. Yeah. So I'll make sure we have that key and learn how to use it. I just heard who contacts. I emailed an associate dean. She got me the contact. So next week we should have access.
Thank you.
Thanks, Russ. Okay, very good. Are you feeling a little better? Okay, you look a little better.
I'm also
Huh?
It's mostly the weather.
Yeah, that was a big impact, isn't it?
Because they got a lot of chronic illnesses.
Okay, okay, well, yeah. Okay, so we'll have access next week, and that'll be good, so, you know, you can come down there to give your presentation, if you so choose. If you wanna give your presentation up here though, and direct me to advance some slides, you can do that as well, however you're most comfortable. Do y'all have your preference? Thank you.
The second day.
Okay, so I gotta compare this to some other requests that I got by email from folks that can't be here today. Y'all get first choice though, for being here. And we do have one request, y'all requested the first day, so I can say you definitely have that one. It looks like everybody else requested the third. Let me see how that corresponds with folks that aren't here today, and I will post the schedule, by Wednesday of this week. Okay, so you'll know if you're going on the first one.
Description of, so I see.
Okay.
Yeah, so we found there's two master upstairs, which included one with like a description, and then there was.
So before we look at our content for today on Gothic art, are there any questions or clarifications about the Lost Art projects? Anything that you need me to clarify for you? You feel good about it? Just gotta get the date right, and I'm gonna kind of do that in the fairest way possible, with y'all getting, priority, but I'm not sure if we're gonna be able to fit everybody in on Wednesday, so I gotta double check that. It's possible that a few more people will have to go on the first, but I'll post that schedule by Wednesday. Okay, so we're gonna turn back to the medieval world and look at Gothic art today. Last time we looked at Romanesque art, and the time before that we were looking at early medieval art. Gothic art is what we see began in the mid-12th century, that's the 1100s, and it begins in France. It begins in France, but ultimately becomes an international style that's popular into the 15th century or the 1400s. It was not known as Gothic at the time. That is a term that is applied backwards. We're used to that, right? Historians or sometimes just scholars of a certain era will look to the past and give it a name. And those scholars in the Renaissance actually didn't like Gothic art very much, and they meant Gothic as sort of a pejorative. Scholars in Italy during the Renaissance preferred a different aesthetic, and they pronounced that this was Gothic, having to do with the Goths, a foreign tribe if one's living in Italy, and they did not like it very much, and so they, gave it this sort of what they considered to be a negative name. Nowadays, I don't think it necessarily carries that connotation, but just want to give you a little bit of background on the use of that word. We are looking at Europe in the Gothic period, and remember, we're going to focus our attention in France, and you can see how that was divided up and how more and more territory was added to French territory throughout the 11 and 1200s. And to discuss Gothic art, we have to go to a very specific place. We're going to go to the Church of Saint-Denis. You're looking at it here in plan. This is the whole church, and we're going to focus on the choir and the ambulatory. The church itself still survives. This is the front. Most of the building was built in an earlier style. windows. But it's this area at the end of the nave, around the apse, known as the ambulatory, that's where people would walk, as well as the choir, where we would expect to see, sort of attention focused from the nave, that gets redone in the 1100s. This was a popular church. People came to visit the relics of Saint Denis, who was an important French saint. If we were to say that in English, it would be Saint Denis, right? But we're in France, so we say Saint Denis, who was a martyr to the Christian faith. And his relics were held at this church, and still are held at this church. And what started to happen was that this area, before it was reconstructed, was very constricted. There wasn't a lot of room for walking. Ambulatory means a walking space. The fancy way of saying to walk is to say to ambulate, right? And especially if one is a pilgrim on a religious journey, wanting to see the relics, you're walking through this area in a crowd. On festival days, on holy days, you want to be closer to those relics so that you can appreciate them, and you're doing that with many, many faithful in the Middle Ages. And apparently, that crowdedness had really started to make this a bad experience. People were shoulder to shoulder, front to back, and it was a crushing crowd. How many of you have been in a crowd that you just don't really like? Maybe going into a concert, leaving a sports game, that kind of thing, and you feel very claustrophobic, right? The abbot at this church, and the abbot is, that's spelled A-B-B-O-T-T. The abbot is sort of the monk in charge of the monastery, right? This is a church that has a monastery attached to it, where monks who devote their life to the service of God would live, and they would pray, and they would do sacred works. The abbot, who is the leader of the monks at this church, decides that it's time to remodel, and this is the remodeled version of the choir and the ambulatory. And thankfully, this still exists. We're not in a situation where we have to imagine it. This still exists. And he has it built. He actually has a hand in the design, together with his architects and artists. He has it built in a new style. And I want to tell you his full name. His name is, Abbot is his title, and he goes by the name of Sujet. Abbot Sujet. And he and his architects build this ambulatory in a new style. I want to see if we can put our skills of observation and visual analysis, which hopefully we have developed over the course of this semester, right? We're nearing the end, sadly, but maybe also joyously, right? Because we can say we concluded a semester, right? We were looking at Romanesque architecture last time. What's different here? What's different? What's new? As you look at these spaces in the Church of Saint Denis. Yes? Yeah, that's a big part of it, right? The Romanesque arch is like the Roman arch, and that's going to be perfectly semicircular, a half circle. And you're going to see barrel vaults if it's extended into space. In Gothic architecture, you still have an arch, but the sides of the arch come to a rounded point. And that allows the arch actually to reach a little bit higher. So we can see here and train our eyes to recognize Gothic arches. And it's probably a little bit easier to see in the image on the left, right? A little bit brighter image. Those arches come to a point. You see the point there? See the point there? You can can maybe even see it a little bit better in the ribbing, right? Those arches are not perfectly round, they come to a point. But the arches go a little bit higher, and they come to a point. What's another difference here? Something we haven't seen in our look at early medieval or Romanesque architecture that we saw last week. And it's okay if you want to pull up the old PowerPoint, pull up the Romanesque PowerPoint, and compare. Or you may just study the two images that I've put up here and notice something new. What else is new and different here? Yes, the stained glass, right? All of this stained glass, and that's why I chose this image that's actually a little bit darker, so we can appreciate the natural light coming through the colored glass, the stained glass. Abbot Suger studied documents that talked about the divinity of light. And you know, it is mentioned in the Bible that God is light, that Jesus is a light to the world. And he saw light in a space like this as having the possibility to raise people's experience, if only for a moment. That when you walk through this church and that beautiful natural light shines not just through a glass window, but through tinted glass, right? Stained glass in these beautiful colors, that it could create an almost heavenly experience. You know, as a religious man, he wanted people to be able to feel divinity, right? In this place, in this work. And Suger believed that one way people could maybe get close to that was through light as it entered the stained glass. Now let's look at a little video. Thank goodness they fixed our speakers. They were not working in the last class. That takes us into this church as it exists today.
Here we are at the Basilica of Saint Denis,
the birthplace of the Gothic.
thanks to Suger, who was the abbot in the first half of the 12th century. This church is incredibly important because it's the burial place of the royal families, and Suger himself was also an advisor to the royal family.
We're standing in the choir and light is pouring in the windows.
So the choir is the space behind the altar of the church, and the ambulatory is the aisle that would take one behind the altar.
Actually, it's taking us around behind the altar.
Now Suger completed the ambulatory and also the facade of the church.
And none of this was new construction. There had been a 9th century church here, and Suger felt that it was inadequate as the burial place of the kings. At this historical moment, the kings of France controlled the Ile-de-France, that is the area immediately around Paris. But this was a time when the king's power was expanding, and Suger really wanted to create an architectural style that would express the growing power of the monarch. Now, in the history of Western church architecture, the way that this would generally work is you would have an ambulatory that would move around the back of the altar, and that would allow pilgrims to stop at each of these small radiating chapels, that is, these small rooms that would contain relics.
In the past, during the Romanesque period, these chapels would be literally separate rooms with walls around them. And Suger's idea was instead to open up the space and to allow light to flood in. And that's exactly how this looks. And it must have looked so different than anything anyone had seen before.
Instead of this looking like a set of walls that are pierced by windows, and in the Romanesque, relatively small windows. Instead, he's figured out how to engineer this structure in stone so that the walls can basically disappear and be replaced by glass, colored glass that lets this brilliant, luminous color into the space. So let's talk about two things: how he did this, and second of all, why he did this.
Yes, which one should we do first?
Well, let's talk about how he did it. If you look above us, there's this complex web of interlocking, pointed vaulting.
Pointed arches are really key here because for one thing, you can cover spaces of different shapes and sizes. Perhaps most importantly, a pointed arch doesn't push so much out as it does down. And because of that, the architect didn't need to build thick walls.
A traditional Roman arch generally has to be placed on quite heavy walls because it really does push outward. It splays. What the pointed arch does is it tends to take the weight of the vaulting and push it more straight down so that the weight doesn't have to be buttressed from the side.
Looking up at those ribs, we have a sense of a pull toward the vertical, and all of these ribs and this vaulting rests on these thin columns. So there's a real sense of elegance and openness to this space.
And it's so radically different from the Romanesque that came before, which felt so solid and where your eye was always drawn around that rounded arch back down, and you felt the sense of gravity, you felt a sort of rootedness with the Romanesque, and it's so different here. You have to remember the church itself, any consecrated church, is an expression of the Holy Jerusalem. It is so the idea is how one translates to a more heavenly place, to a more spiritual place. Abbot Suger believed that light could do this.
Suger thought he was reading the writing of Saint Denis, of the patron saint of this church.
Instead, he was reading a philosopher from the 6th century. But the important part is he took this notion of the divinity of light from that writing and made that practical and applicable within an architectural setting.
Right, that writing that he thought was by Saint Denis talked about how light was connected to the divine. So what Suger wanted was to open up those walls and allow in the light that would allow a type of thinking on the part of the visitors where they would move from the contemplation of the light to God.
This was a radical and new notion and actually flew in the face of other theological theories of the time. And if you think about the ideas that are being established by St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who's saying we have to get rid of all of the decorative, we have to get rid of everything that will distract us. Suger is moving in the other direction and saying, no, in fact, we can transport people.
That the visual is not a distraction, but a way of transporting us to the divine.
I have to say that I think Suger was incredibly successful. This is startlingly beautiful, and I feel transported.
So I noticed I spelled Abbott wrong. I spelled Abbott like the last name, but when it's the title, when it's the leader of the monastery, it just has one T. Right, so fix that in your notes. I like that video too because we get still photography, but we also space, and you can see what it was like to ambulate, to walk through that space, to appreciate the light, see the pointed arches, and see how the space is more opened up and becomes more ethereal, more divine, at least according to Abbott's design, right? So that's where the Gothic is born, and it continues to become more popular in France, and then eventually makes its way to Germany and even to Italy over time. We're not going to look at every Gothic building. I want us to look at this church, the Cathedral of Notre Dame at the city of Chartres, as an example of a more fully realized Gothic, right? At Saint-Denis, it's really concentrated in the choir and the ambulatory, those spaces behind the altar that house the relics. And here the entire church is built in the Gothic style. And, these churches take generations to build. That's quite a long time. You can see 1145 to 1220 for the building to be constructed. You'll notice here as well, this building isn't perfectly symmetrical, because this spire is a replacement. It was replaced in the 1500s, the 16th century, or the 1500s, after a fire. How many of you remember the fire at Notre Dame in Paris? Just happened in 2019, right? So we saw that, we lived through that, and we saw it probably many different camera angles on social media, on the news, etc. Those fires happened throughout history, right? And this church, the fire was not quite as damaging as the fire at Notre Dame in Paris, but it did destroy one of the spires, and then that was replaced in the newest Gothic style that you can see is a little bit more decorative on the outside. These more and more decoration, these little signals, as they're called, that give even more decoration than the slightly more simplified example that you see there on the right. These churches are grand. The pointed arch and stained glass and the flying buttress, which I'll introduce shortly, allowed architects of this period to build bigger, especially taller and bolder buildings. And the size as well as the verticality, the height of these churches really does show where most of the resources were put from a community at this time in history. They were put into the religious structure. This is the rest of the city, right? Much shorter buildings, and then the massive church. And the Gothic style really is all about height, verticality. As architects continue to work with the engineering of the pointed arch, it's possible for them to build higher and higher. You saw in the video, the thrust of the pointed arch directs more downward than out, and that allows those architects to really keep pushing and building taller and taller structures. Now,
I am in class, but please like and subscribe.
Here, you're looking down the nave into the choir. There's the altar in front of the choir. You just see the side aisles. What do those elements tell us about how this building is planned? What kind of plan is this structure? That terminates in an apse with side aisles. Yes, it's a basilica, right? This is still built on the basilica plan, which we saw developed in early Christian Rome, right? Based on the Roman form of the basilica, which was first used for the courthouse, for the law court building. So this is, even though it's very tall and in a more decorative style than we've seen so far, it's still built in that traditional basilica plan with a long central nave terminating in apse, flanked by
Please
side
like and
aisles.
subscribe.
It is also cruciform. We have a transept that crosses the basilica and makes the shape of the cross in the plan of the building. You'll notice in the plan we can also read the ribbed vaults that we see on the ceiling of this structure. Notice the series of pointed arches that carry the side aisles, that support the ceiling, and the great vaulted entry here. Now, how do these architects continue to build upward, upward, upward in stone, and then pierce the walls with stained glass? They put some of the supportive elements of the building on the exterior. Because these buildings buildings are just lined with glass. Every wall pierced with glass. You would think that would, make it impossible to build taller, then pierce that stone with glass. How do we support this structure? It's done almost with an exoskeleton. And if you look at the structure, look closely here. Sorry, here. Do you see all of these exterior supports? And here, and here, and here, and here. Those are all what we call flying buttresses that buttress or support the building from the outside. And we can see it in this transverse section. So this is the nave, this is the side aisle, and here, that's the edge of the building, right? Here we're outside. And look at this massive stone buttress, has a deep foundation, lower than the floor of the side aisle, and it continues upward, bracing the building from the outside. It's here in the clear story that we expect more stained glass. And then we have what are called flying buttresses. They're sort of half arches, right? That fly over from the buttress and support the building from the exterior, right? And this is necessary in particular when you get wind shears and glass, right? You need the building to be braced and flying buttress like that from the exterior. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's that technology of the pointed arch and the flying buttress that then allow these buildings to be bigger, taller, and also pierced with glass, so that you have that wonderful ethereal and even divine experience as Abbot Sujet describes it. The windows are everywhere. We see rose windows taking the form of the rose flower at the entrance and also in the transepts. And those are symbolic of Mary and Mary's purity. And then we see important religious figures throughout the windows. We could do an entire semester's course on all of the imagery in the windows at Chartres Cathedral. It's that detailed. You can see some of it here, right? Each of these has not just color, but also imagery representing important religious figures, Jesus, Mary, saints, kings and queens, etc. We'll use one window as an example. This is a window that I want you to know for the exam. There's its name in French, Notre Dame de la Belle Verrière, of the beautiful window. Notre Dame means in French, Our Lady. Notre Dame means Our Lady. Who is Our Lady? They're referring to Mary. Mary, the mother of Jesus. And we see here, and I'm going to turn the light down so you can get a slightly better view. We see here in this window, in the center, notice it's in hieratic scale, right? Excuse me. You see in the center a very large figure of Mary, and seated on her lap, the baby Jesus. Then we see various angels with wings, kind of telling us as viewers what to do, to kneel and pray and praise Mary and Jesus. These windows, remember, are communicating the values, stories of the Christian faith, right? Not a lot of people were literate at this time in history. So they would hear a priest read a Bible verse or talk about a Bible verse at a sermon, but that hearing would be combined with looking at imagery that depicts in sculpture, in windows, the stories and the important figures. And you can see in this detail the figure of Mary. Notice that she wears a crown, almost like like a medieval queen, as well as a halo of light around her head, and we see the angels kneeling before her. It's very didactic for people to know what to do in front of this window, to pray, right? To offer a prayer. And people still do today. And you can also light a candle. You pay, put a coin in, purchase a candle, and people will light a candle and say a prayer in front of this window. This window is one of the oldest in the church. Some of the windows have been replaced over time. This is one of the oldest, and it actually survived a fire. So it's regarded as, one of the most important and one of the holiest windows in the church. And look at that combination of colors. This is Notre Dame in Paris. This is a plan of Notre Dame in Paris. And you can see the smaller, actually the time scale on this. In the city, and it's a bit smaller, not quite as tall as Chartres Cathedral. It is a basilica. It is also cruciform, but the crossing, right, the transept is not as big, right, as we see at Chartres Cathedral. And so, this is something to think about in the terminology. A lot of the churches are called Notre Dame, right? Our Lady. And then what you see second is the city. This is in Paris. Chartres is in the city of Paris. That's not too far, actually, from Paris. It's along the pilgrimage route if somebody was walking along the Camino, making their way to the north of Spain. This is a picture of Notre Dame before the fire, and they have completed the restoration, the beautiful restoration of the church, and they were able to salvage most everything, not the roof, of course, but some things had to be repaired and cleaned, but there's a miraculous sort of rebirth of this church after the fire. And you can get a sense of the crossing here, as well as the height, as well as the light and the windows. Here's the facade of the church. Not too much of the facade was damaged in the fire. It was the roof and this part of the church that was damaged, and you can see how it fits into the city. I will note that most of the sculpture here on the front of the church is not medieval. It dates to the 1800s because in the 1700s, this building was attacked during the French Revolution. The citizens of Paris and of France really associated the monarchy with the church. Those were the two big institutions. And when the king and queen of France were overthrown, they also hacked away at the church and purposely destroyed a lot of the